February 1943, Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. A Japanese naval commander stood on the bridge of his destroyer, watching through binoculars as American B-25 Mitchell bombers approached at 8,000 feet. He performed a quick mental calculation. Medium bombers hit moving ships less than 5% of the time. His convoy had 16 destroyers with full anti-aircraft batteries. The math was simple. These bombers posed no real threat. What he didn't know was that these weren't ordinary B-25s. 8 transport ships sat in the harbor below him, packed with 6,800 troops destined for New Guinea. The entire operation depended on this convoy reaching its destination. But the commander felt no concern about the aircraft circling above. Japanese naval doctrine had been clear since World War I. Only torpedo bombers and dive bombers could seriously threaten warships. Medium bombers like the B-25 simply lacked the precision. The numbers backed this up completely. High-altitude bombing accuracy against moving ships hovered between 2% and 4% on good days. The B-25's standard payload consisted of 4 500-pound bombs dropped from thousands of feet. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers bristled with defensive armament. Each ship carried 127 mm main guns, 25 mm autocannons, and 13 mm machine guns. The vessels could maneuver at 32 knots, executing evasive patterns that made them nearly impossible to hit from above. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had assessed the situation in 1942, stating clearly that medium bombers were ineffective against naval targets. Recent combat had proven him right. Allied bombing runs during the Coral Sea battle had failed spectacularly. At Midway, high-altitude attacks had wasted bomb after bomb with almost nothing to show for it. Across the Pacific, American frustration had reached a breaking point. The U.S. Fifth Air Force was losing pilots and wasting ordnance at an alarming rate. The numbers from early 1942 told a devastating story. 67 high-altitude bombing missions had been flown against Japanese shipping. Over 1,200 bombs had been dropped. Only 14 ships had been hit. The accuracy rate sat at a miserable 1.2%. 23 aircraft had been lost in the process. General George Kenney faced an impossible dilemma. He desperately needed to stop Japanese convoys from reinforcing their Pacific strongholds, but torpedo bombers proved too vulnerable to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. His conventional bombing approach simply wasn't working. Then came Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. A combat-hardened pilot with an engineering background, Gunn had been studying the problem from every angle. He'd survived enough failed bombing runs to understand the fundamental flaw in their tactics. One afternoon in November 1942, he made his case to anyone who would listen. "We're fighting the wrong way," he insisted. "Get low, get close, make every bullet count." His proposal seemed radical to the point of suicide. Gunn wanted to completely redesign the B-25. His plan called for removing the bombardier and the entire glass nose cone. In their place, he would install 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. But the real innovation went beyond the firepower. Gunn proposed a technique called skip bombing. The modified B-25s would attack at 200 to 500 feet above the water, releasing their bombs to skip across the surface like flat stones. The bombs would strike enemy ships at or below the waterline, where the damage would be catastrophic. The skepticism was immediate and fierce. "You'll fly straight into their anti-aircraft fire," one colonel argued. "One lucky hit and you're dead," another added. "The recoil from 8 machine guns will tear the plane apart," the engineers warned. Gunn had an answer for every objection. He'd been studying captured Japanese documents that revealed a critical vulnerability. Japanese anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress below 5 degrees. They were designed to hit high-altitude bombers, not aircraft skimming the waves. A plane flying at 200 feet would pass completely under their firing arc. The ships would be defenseless. In January 1943, Gunn got permission for a test. A modified B-25 faced off against a derelict freighter sitting in the harbor. The bomber came in low and fast. At the perfect moment, the pilot released a 250-pound bomb. It skipped across the water 6 times before slamming into the ship amidships. But before the bomb even hit, the B-25's 8 machine guns had opened fire. In just 8 seconds, 2,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition shredded the freighter's superstructure. The test crew could barely believe what they'd witnessed. The Japanese commander in Rabaul Harbor knew none of this. He had no idea that American tactics had fundamentally changed. As far as he understood, the approaching B-25s would drop their bombs from altitude, miss by hundreds of yards, and fly away. His ships would continue their mission unscathed. This had been the pattern for 2 years of war. He saw no reason it would change now. The convoy would depart the next morning. The fog forecast for the journey would provide additional protection. With 8 destroyers escorting 8 transports, carrying nearly 7,000 troops, 920 tons of ammunition, and critical supplies, the mission seemed completely secure. Mathematical certainty backed by naval doctrine backed by 2 years of combat experience. But certainty can be a fatal comfort. As the commander prepared his departure orders, 12 modified B-25s were being armed at a base 400 miles away. Their pilots had been practicing skip bombing for 6 weeks. Their gun barrels had been replaced with reinforced versions that could handle the heat of sustained fire. The bombardiers had been retrained as forward gunners. Everything was ready. The Japanese doctrine was about to meet American innovation in the most devastating way possible. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul under heavy fog, exactly as planned. The commanding officer calculated the odds one final time. 16 ships sailing together, 8 destroyers providing escort, weather conditions obscuring them from aerial observation. Safe passage seemed guaranteed. The mathematics of naval warfare supported every assumption. But 400 miles away, 137 Allied aircraft were already tracking the convoy's position. 12 modified B-25s sat fueled and ready. The pilots knew exactly where the Japanese were heading. The fog the Japanese counted on for protection would clear by morning. And when it did, everything would change. March 2nd arrived with clearing skies. Japanese confidence remained intact. The 8 transport ships maintained their tight formation. Shirayuki, Tokitsuke's, Yukike's, Asagumo, Arashio, Asashio, Shikanami, and Uranami formed a protective screen around them. The transports carried 6,912 troops, each soldier representing Japan's desperate attempt to reinforce New Guinea. Below deck sat 920 tons of ammunition. Every ship's anti-aircraft guns stood manned and ready. But the gunners were watching the sky above them, scanning for high-altitude bombers. They never looked down at the wave tops. They never saw the B-25s coming in at 50 feet above the water. March 3, 10 a.m. Captain Ed Larner's B-25 screamed toward the destroyer Shirayuki at 280 miles per hour, barely 250 feet above the ocean surface. His 8 forward guns opened fire at 1,000 yards. The sound was apocalyptic. Tracer rounds created visible streams of destruction as 2,400 rounds per minute poured into the destroyer. Shirayuki's deck guns were destroyed in 4 seconds. The anti-aircraft crew died before they could return fire. Their guns simply couldn't depress low enough to target Larner's aircraft. Then came the bomb. Released at the perfect angle, the 500-pound weapon skipped across the water 3 times before penetrating Shirayuki's hull below the waterline. The destroyer broke in half. 90 seconds after the first shot was fired, Shirayuki disappeared beneath the waves. The Japanese officers on nearby ships couldn't process what they just witnessed. Impossible, one radioed. Medium bombers don't attack like fighters. But 11 more B-25s were already lining up their runs. The next 12 minutes became a masterclass in the new American tactics. 3 more destroyers took crippling hits. 4 transport ships were struck, 2 of them already sinking. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire proved largely ineffective. Gun crews died at their stations, cut down by strafing runs before they could aim. The guns that did fire missed completely. The B-25s were simply too low, too fast, and too heavily armed. The Japanese attempted to adapt. Ships increased speed and broke formation, trying to make themselves harder targets. The B-25s responded by attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. The afternoon attacks turned the sea into a graveyard. Transport ship Kayakasi Maru took 1,800 rounds to its bridge. The officers died instantly. A 500-pound bomb struck amidships. The vessel sank within minutes. Tio Maru suffered an even more spectacular fate. A skip bomb penetrated its fuel tanks. The resulting fireball could be seen 20 miles away. The destroyer Tokitsuke's attempted evasive maneuvers but caught 2 bombs in rapid succession. Its magazine exploded. The ship sank in 45 seconds, taking 197 sailors with it. Lieutenant Jack Hennebrey's B-25 took anti-aircraft fire during his approach run. A lucky shot punctured his fuel tank. Gasoline streamed behind his aircraft in a visible trail. Protocol demanded he abort the attack and return to base. Hennebrey ignored protocol. He maintained his course straight at the transport Nojima. His 8 guns destroyed the ship's bridge and superstructure. His bomb skipped twice and struck perfectly at the waterline. Nojima listed immediately and began to sink. Only then did Hennebrey pull up and head for the nearest beach. He crash-landed on the sand, his plane intact enough that he and his crew walked away. Behind him, Nojima slipped beneath the waves. By nightfall on March 3, 6 transports had been sunk. 3 destroyers were destroyed. The ocean was littered with debris and survivors clinging to wreckage. March 4 brought no mercy. The remaining Japanese ships scattered, each captain desperately trying to reach safety. The B-25s hunted them individually like wolves running down wounded prey. PT boats joined the chase. Both fighters added their firepower. There was no escape. By 6 p.m. on March 4, the final tally was complete. All 8 transport ships rested on the ocean floor. 4 destroyers had been sunk outright: Shirayuki, Tokitsuke's, Asashio, and Arashio. 2 more destroyers had been so heavily damaged they would never sail again. Of the 6,912 troops who had boarded the transports, 2,890 were dead. The 920 tons of ammunition sat in the depths. Only 850 troops managed to reach La, a fraction of what had been intended. The entire convoy had been annihilated. Allied losses stood in stark contrast. 4 aircraft had been destroyed: 2 B-25s, 1 Beaufighter, and 1 P-38. 13 airmen had been killed. The exchange ratio was devastating for Japan. The surviving Japanese commander filed his report with shaking hands. Enemy employed new tactic with devastating effect. Our anti-aircraft defenses proved inadequate against low-level attack. The truth was even more brutal than he admitted. Skip bombing accuracy had reached 37%. That was nearly 20 times better than traditional high-altitude bombing. The B-25s equipped with 75mm cannons had fired 32 rounds during the battle, each one finding its mark. The weapon the Japanese had dismissed as harmless had just destroyed an entire convoy. The bomber that couldn't hurt ships had proven it could obliterate them. March 10, 1943. Japanese Naval Command held an emergency meeting in Tokyo. The Bismarck Sea disaster demanded immediate response. Officers who had spent decades developing naval doctrine now faced an uncomfortable reality. Their assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. The emergency directive that emerged ordered immediate installation of additional low-angle guns on all vessels. But the real change went deeper. Daylight convoy operations were banned within range of Allied air bases. The entire Japanese naval strategy in the Southwest Pacific had to be rewritten because of one American innovation. General Douglas MacArthur called it a victory of the first magnitude. Admiral Chester Nimitz immediately requested modified B-25s for the Central Pacific Theater. He'd seen the reports. He wanted that capability for his own operations. Production acceleration began within days. By June 1943, 150 B-25s had been modified with the forward-firing gun packages. But American engineers weren't finished innovating. The B-25G variant emerged with a 75mm cannon mounted in the nose. Then came the B-25H, the most heavily armed bomber in World War II. 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns gave it firepower that exceeded most fighter aircraft. These weren't just bombers anymore. They were flying destroyers designed specifically to annihilate shipping. May 1943 brought the next demonstration at Wewak Harbor. 30 modified B-25s attacked a Japanese supply base in a coordinated strike. 15 cargo ships sat at anchor alongside 3 destroyers and 40 supply barges. The attack lasted 18 minutes. When the smoke cleared, every single vessel had been destroyed or was sinking. Japanese losses totaled over 1,200 tons of shipping capacity. The Allies lost 1 B-25. The mathematical impossibility the Japanese had calculated just months earlier had become routine American tactics. July 1943 saw an even larger operation at Simpson Harbor. 85 B-25s and A-20s executed a coordinated strike against concentrated Japanese shipping. 44 ships were sunk or damaged beyond repair. The Japanese abandoned the harbor for 6 months. It was no longer safe to concentrate vessels anywhere within Allied bomber range. The statistics told an undeniable story. In 1942, before the modifications, American medium bombers had dropped 1,200 bombs and achieved 14 hits. The accuracy rate of 1.2% made high-altitude bombing nearly worthless against ships. In 1943, using skip bombing tactics, 840 bombs achieved 312 hits. The accuracy rate jumped to 37%. The ammunition expenditure revealed the intensity of the new tactics. American forces fired 18 million .50 caliber rounds from modified bombers in 1943 alone. Every round served a purpose, suppressing anti-aircraft fire, killing gun crews, destroying ship superstructures, and creating chaos before the bombs even arrived. Captain Ralph DeLoach pushed the tactics even further. He developed what he called masthead bombing, flying even lower than the standard skip bombing approach. DeLoach brought his B-25 down to 10 feet above the water during attack runs. At that altitude, he was essentially flying between the waves. Japanese gunners couldn't track him. Their weapons couldn't depress far enough. DeLoach personally sank 7 ships in 3 months using this technique. He became a legend among Pacific aircrews, the man who proved you could always fly lower, always get closer, always be more aggressive. The Japanese tried everything to counter the new American tactics. They deployed balloon barrages hoping to force the B-25s to higher altitudes. The American pilots simply flew under the balloons. Japan increased anti-aircraft crews on every ship, adding more gunners to compensate for the losses during attacks. The American strafing runs killed the additional crews before they could engage. Engineers added armored deck plating to protect against the devastating .50 caliber fire. But the skip bombs struck below the waterline where no deck armor could help. Fighter escorts were assigned to protect convoys. They successfully engaged some bombers but couldn't prevent the attacks on the ships themselves. Every countermeasure failed. October 1943 marked a crisis point for Japanese logistics. Merchant fleet losses reached 478,000 tons in just 3 months. Analysts determined that 40% of those losses came directly from modified B-25s and A-20 Havocs using the new tactics. The convoy system that had sustained Japanese operations across the Pacific began to break down. Ships couldn't reach their destinations. Troops went without supplies. Island garrisons started to starve. The Naval Analysis Report from November 1943 admitted the scope of the disaster. The enemy's low-level bombing and strafing tactics have rendered our standard naval defense systems obsolete. No effective countermeasure has been developed. It was an extraordinary admission from a Navy that prided itself on tactical superiority. The final statistics from the Pacific War painted the complete picture. Between 1943 and 1945, modified B-25s sank 392 Japanese ships outright. Another 627 vessels were damaged so severely they never returned to service. Beyond the major ships, the bombers destroyed over 1,500 barges and small craft that formed the backbone of inter-island logistics. American aircrews fired 75 million .50 caliber rounds in the process. The tactical impact reshaped the entire theater. Japanese forces were restricted to night operations only. Major shipping routes were abandoned completely. Troop reinforcement capability dropped by 67%. Islands that should have been reinforced were left to die on the vine. A Japanese admiral's post-war statement captured the fundamental failure. We never imagined the medium bomber could be adapted to such devastating anti-ship use. Our doctrine failed to anticipate American innovation. The irony was complete. Japan's rigid adherence to established naval doctrine had met American battlefield adaptation. The weapon they had laughed at, the bomber they calculated couldn't hurt them, had destroyed over 1,000 ships. Modern military forces learned the lesson. The AC-130 gunship uses remarkably similar tactics, heavy forward armament combined with low-level attack profiles. The principal Pappy gun discovered in 1942 remains valid today. Get low, get close, and make every shot count. The bomber that couldn't hurt ships had rewritten the rules of naval warfare.